الله بالخير. سيمور هيرش يكشف أن تفجير السيل الشمالي واحد واثنين كان بأمر مباشر من الرئيس الأميركي جو بايدن، وأن المواد المتفجرة زرعت خلال تدريبات للناتو في بحر البلطيق. لماذا صمتت وسائل الإعلام الأمريكية عن عمل تخريبي هو بمثابة إعلان حرب؟ هل سيمثل تقرير هيرش فتيل حرب عالمية؟ وأين تقف ألمانيا من عمل عدائي أضر بمجتمعها واقتصادها؟ هل يدفع التضخم الحاد في أوروبا الشعوب إلى الثورة؟ نرحب بكم ونرى ونسمع أكثر من ضيفنا الصحفي الاستقصائي الأمريكي سيمور هيرش، ونعقب في البعد الأقرب. هذه الميادين وأنا زينب صفار، خليكم ويانا. Seymour Hersh, American award-winning investigative journalist who exposed the My Lai massacre committed by U.S. troops in Vietnam in 1968, chronicled U.S. military's torture of prisoners at Abu Ghraib prison in 2004, and recently divulged how America took out the Nord Stream pipeline. Seymour Hersh, hello and welcome, sir, to Al-Mayadeen. This is the proximate aspect. Lovely to talk to you, sir.
Hello, hello.
Hi. Well, in your report, you have detailed the lengthy process which started more than 10 months ago, and that there was a big debate inside the intelligence community whether to do it or not to do it. And President Biden personally gave the go-ahead, as you said, and you referred to in your report, by carrying out this act of sabotage, of eco-terror that may have killed hundreds of thousands in Europe. What message did the U.S. intend to deliver to the Russians, their fellow Europeans, and the Germans in particular, and what are the international implications, sir?
Well, everybody has a different opinion on everything. So what I wrote was, very simply, I just told the story of how maybe 2 months before the Russians actually invaded, when it was very clear that that the Russian government, Putin, was going to invade Ukraine. There'd been a lot of back and forth for a year before that, and was beginning to mass troops on the border. At that point, the White House was trying. My guess is they began to organize a series of meetings. Very highly secret meetings involving the usual groups, then the Central Intelligence Agency, our signals group, the National Security Agency, the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the military, the State Department, the Treasury Department. They began to meet in a secret room next door to the White House. And the issue was, what are we going to do? Is there anything we can do to stop Mr. Putin, to convince him that the cost will be too high? And out of this meeting emerged the question they asked. Actually, the term of art was, they asked this group, not a big group. The question was, the group said, "Do you want something reversible or irreversible?" In other words, something reversible would be a sanction. We've done a lot of sanctioning. Ask the Cubans about sanction. We've been sanctioning Cuba since 1961. It still seems to be there. The other issue was, you want something that's not reversible, something kinetic, blow up something. And eventually, it determined that we were going to, let's get a plan, if possible, to blow up the pipeline.
So at the time of the bombing of the Nord Stream pipeline, senior U.S. and European leaders bragged and cheered about this act of sabotage. Yet, after your thunderous report, a White House spokesperson said, quote, "This is false and complete fiction." Also, a spokesperson for the CIA said the same too. On the other hand, the Security Council heatedly debated Russia's request for a UN-led inquiry into the explosions. Why is the Biden administration denying it now? Could your report findings, sir, trigger a multifaceted cosmic confrontation?
I think that what happened is the first response officially came 4 days later, when Jake Sullivan, the national security advisor to President Biden, at a news conference asked about it, and he was asked whether Russia did it.
Yes.
And of course, he didn't say no, but he said, well, Russia's, accusing the Americans of doing it or raising questions about it. And what he said was, we'll have this. He didn't offer an investigation. What he said is Swedes and the Danes. The explosion took place on an island right in the Baltic Sea, but very close to Sweden and Denmark. In fact, literally on the waters that belonged to both countries, what they call the littoral rights, the rights to the sea fish and all that other stuff under the Baltic Sea, belong to those two countries. What he said is they're going to do an investigation, and we'll talk about it then. And what happened is 3 weeks later, the Swedes and the Danes reported that guess what? There was something that happened, blew up underneath. That was the investigation to say already. But to say that what America was doing, there's a long history in America, in the United States, of being, of course, in the Cold War. And since the Kennedy administration, I think you can go back and find there's been a real worry about the fact that Russia has, as you know, communist Russia then in the 60s, had tremendous deposits of natural gas and oil, and they were selling it to Germany and to Western Europe. And we in America were always worried that Russia was what we called weaponizing the gas. In other words, the communists were buying favor even with NATO countries and Western Europe countries because they supplied gas. That was always a long-standing problem with us. We wanted Russia to have no such power. But unfortunately, Western Europe has no natural gas of its own or oil, and they relied on other people. So that's been a theme. So the United States, within 4 or 5 days after the explosion, the United States, Anthony Blinken, the Secretary of State, who's very clear, he, like Sullivan and like Victoria Nuland, the Undersecretary, are very hostile to Russia. Even though Russia's no longer communist, but still they are, and also very tough on China. And so 4 days after the event, he said...
But they completely denied that whatever you have mentioned in your report, sir, is false. And you were also discredited, by the way, by some mainstream media outlets.
Well, I think a lot of people were really very upset by the story.
Right. Allow me here to... Yes.
Well, let me just say, I've been doing this for 50 years. The issue was I didn't name the sources. As if I had, they wouldn't be in jail the next day. But I've been doing this for 50 years, as you said in the introduction.
Right.
So when you write something, when you write a story that nobody else knows about, why sometimes there's always that kind of complaint. I don't know, and so I'm used to that.
Right. Allow me here to ask you, sir, how come your source with direct knowledge of the detailed process to come up with a plan for the destruction of the 2 Nord Stream pipelines, acting on the desires and authorization of the President Biden, and after a series of top secret meetings, decide to divulge the matter for you, and why?
I can give you my opinion of why, but I don't know why. I think they who did this mission were initially asked to look. There was a study. This is all in that article you mentioned, the Substack article I wrote. And you have to wonder why somebody like me is not writing in the New York Times about this stuff, as I had for many years. So about 8 years writing stories for the New York Times and the very best New York Review books, the London Review books. And why not? It's because the things have changed a lot. And newspaper business, but that's another story.
Right.
What I can say to you, I think the motive for the people who were assigned to do it was they wanted to give the White House some weapons such as if you let the president be able to say to Russia, to Putin, if you attack, as we think you are, from Belarus into Ukraine, if you by this time they were building up 100,000 people were on the border by January, 100,000 Russians.
Right.
Clearly, he had been for whatever reasons Putin was coming, and the idea was to give the president an opportunity to perhaps tell the Russians, you will not have this, Russian gas will never flow again. We can take out the pipeline.
In the immediate aftermath of the pipeline bombing, the American media treated it like an unsolved mystery. The absence of any re-reporting on the subject seems even more striking. We're talking here as journalists. Russia was repeatedly cited as a likely culprit. However, the Washington Post recently published an unusually off-script report like 2 months ago, quoting European officials asserting that there was no evidence that Russia was behind the attack. Still today, there is a dearth of mainstream coverage, especially after your report. Why? Kill the messenger, ignore the message thing. Why the urge to attack the messenger rather than grill officials over your claims?
Oh, that's a question I in my pillow at night when I go to sleep. I say, oh, why, oh, why? If you want to know my thoughts, and my thought is Biden in late September, the dynamite, it was C4 plastiques. The dynamite was planted by late May, early June last year, and he had the right to shoot whenever he wanted to. He didn't fire away, hit the button, like lighting a match, whatever the cliche is. He didn't authorize the bombing until September the 26th. And that would have been 7 months after the war began. And at that point, even though the Western press was talking about the great victories of Ukraine, the inside reporting here, the serious reporting from the intelligence communities, and I do know something about that, was that at best, it's going to be a long stalemate. And as now, the United States has put in $113 billion worth of arms and stuff. Much of it we know is being stolen by the generals and by Zelensky himself. Much of it is not getting where it should go, but a lot is getting there, and it's not enough. So by September, late September, the only reason I can understand he decided then to bomb is it was going to be a longer, more expensive war. It seems to me it seems to me that Joe Biden and his three
hawks,
super hawks, Blinken and Winken. There's a children's book. I call those three Winken, Blinken, and Nod. There's an American book about that. All they do is they just went to China, and our Secretary of State waved his finger in the face in public of a Chinese, his counterpart in China, the foreign minister. It's just we're trying to be as provocative as we can be. And what is the game? Do we want to go to war with Russia? The American.
What about Germany, sir? Where does Germany stand from a hostile act that harmed its society, its economy, its food basket, its lungs? What was the point of crippling the European industrial base through imposing these sky-high energy costs on it?
I think the fear was, and of course I don't know, I'm not in Joe Biden's mind. I'm not in the mind of the three principals who do the foreign policy is run by Blinken, Winken, and Nod. No question. I don't know how directly the president is involved in that. And but the best assessment you can make, he blew up the mines in late September when it blew up the pipelines rather in late September, when it was clear that the war was going to be longer and more costly. There was resistance from Germany in particular, because Germany, because of what it did in World War II, has always been resistant to rearming itself. And there was resistance from Germany. There was also and I think the fear was that even NATO and Western Europe and Germany might, in the long run, decide that enough is enough. We've given you guns and tanks. we're going to draw a line at this because we don't see a way out. We don't see a way for the Ukrainian military to win. Maybe you could get a stalemate, but what the cost of any negotiation is going to be pretty high. Ukraine will never be accepted into NATO. I think that I do think Putin may have thought so, but I don't know what he thought. But the bottom line is what Joe Biden showed Western Europe and Germany in my book. He showed them that we're the country that always had the back of Western Europe. We always supported them as long as they stayed anti-communist and democracy. And they were very democratic. After World War II, they were pretty modeled. You could almost model on the American democracy. They were democracies. What I thought what Biden was seen to be done by the Germans, and many have talked to me, and I don't talk to politicians. He's told them in Western Europe and NATO that if they won't help him all the way in the Ukraine, and he was worried about that, he's not going to give them a chance this fall. That was winter coming to open up the pipeline. The new pipeline, Nord Stream 2, had been stopped by the German government by request. So he's basically said, I'm not going to let you keep everybody warm and wealthy and happy if you don't support me. So I'm going to take away the pipeline in fear that you will just turn it on, even though I don't want you to. And this goes back to, as I said in the beginning, to the long-standing worry about Russia using gas as a weapon, political weapon.
But will the severe inflation in Europe push the people to the brink of a revolution? I mean, we've seen we've seen the demonstrations, the protests. People took to the streets. You talked about that.
It's nowhere near a revolution. I mean, but it is a political force. It's an unhappiness. I think that the Chancellor Scholz, I think he's going to have political problems. I know that in the Bundestag, their parliament, people have called me from all sides, all political sides, and I told you to come and talk, and I'm not doing it. But there's a lot of concern just about the issue I raised, that if the American president was so willing to cut off a major source of inexpensive gas for us, there was so much gas provided by Nord Stream 1 that went into business in 2011, and Putin himself stopped that one about 2 years ago in anger at us. There's so much gas that the German gas was the Germans were reselling the gas. They had more gas than they needed. They were taking the Russian gas they were getting from Nord Stream 1 and selling it downstream themselves to other providers.
True.
And making and Russia let that happen. So it was a political force for Russia. Revolution is, there are some people who think it's going to hurt. It's certainly going to hurt the relationships of NATO, some people in that.
But inflation stakes are so high. Many industries have closed their doors. Lots of people are hungry. There's no electricity.
But let's put it in focus. It's not quite as bad as that. Electricity in France is 5 times as much. That's terrible. That's a big cost. The price of natural gas in Italy is 3 to 3.5 times. In Germany, you know how frugal the Germans are. They've always had a reservation of money, and they've been subsidizing the oil, the cost of gas as much as 20, and in some places 25%. In Germany, they're substituting, but you have things like this. Just to put it, downsize it a little bit. Your language is a little ripe. The largest chemical company in the world is BASF. In Germany has 100,000 employees. They just laid off some employees. They are talking to China about moving some of their production facilities there because there's the chance of easier gas there in China, believe it or not, than even here without the pipeline. They had a mild winter, but they don't have enough reserve gas for next winter, and without the pipeline, there's no question there's going to be a dramatic increase in the price of fuel, and the government won't be able to subsidize it. But right now, the electricity prices per kilowatt are pretty stable because the average person, the government is subsidizing 20-25%. Otherwise, everybody be paying at least
Let's see how much they can hold on and go on like that. But allow me to ask you something about something that you have written about recently. Why did much of the secret planning and training for the operation take place in Norway? And why were highly skilled seamen and technicians from the Norwegian Navy involved?
Well, I've never said I never talked about high-level technicians. I just said that the Norwegians helped. Well, I've done that first story I did that you're talking about. It was the first thing I've ever done in Substack. And by the way, a fair question to ask is, why wouldn't I take it to the New York Times where I worked, or to the Washington Post where I live in the city for years and know people there? Because it's a different community. They went. I did this famous story about the My Lai massacre in Vietnam that changed the war, I think, by at least the perception of the war. We murdered 500 people. At that time, I couldn't get that story into the New York Times or the Washington Post. So I know the limits. Substack allows me to publish myself, even if and so Norway. I've written other stories in Substack, three more since this one. And one of the stories was about the fact that Norway has a long-standing secret relationship with the United States. And for example, in the Vietnam War, long before we declared war, long before President Johnson got authority from the Congress to send troops abroad, Norwegians are wonderful seamen. They have wonderful advanced, what we call patrol boats, PT boats, and we were running operations with the CIA and Navy SEALs. These are our SEALs, our commandos, special operations people, into North Vietnam for a long time, and trying to provoke the North. We were going after radar stations. We were doing a lot of damage inside, trying to get the North to do something that Johnson could use. To tell the people how horrible the North was, and we've got to go to war. And as we turned out, and eventually we fabricated, and they were so frustrated. They so much wanted a war. McNamara, the Secretary of Defense, and Lyndon Johnson in 1964. He'd been president 1 year. And I think they thought they were carrying out what Jack Kennedy, who was killed the year before, murdered. I think Johnson, he thought he was doing what Kennedy would want. I don't know this, but Johnson always supported the war as Kennedy did. Johnson, we invented an attack on an American destroyer by a North Vietnamese PT boat. It didn't happen, but we told the public they had attacked our ship with torpedoes. And Johnson made a famous speech in the middle of summer of May, I think it was, of 1964. And he said, for the first time, we must respond, American honor. And he bombed North Vietnam for the first time. And one of the stories I've written on Substack since that first story said how false everything was. And the big player there was the Norwegians. Right. Because they had some boats. So we have a long history of dirty collaboration. Absolutely.
Right. It wasn't Seymour Hirsch, distinguished investigative journalist. Thank you very much, sir, for diagnosing and exposing this matter in absolute depth. Always a pleasure to have you.
It was always fun arguing with you too. Okay. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you. إذا كان اثنان من خطوط الأنابيب اللذان عرفا مجتمعين باسم السيل الشمالي واحد يزودان ألمانيا وكثيرا من دول أوروبا الغربية بالغاز الطبيعي الروسي الرخيص لأكثر من عقد من الزمن، وهو ما يكفي لتشغيل مصانعها وتدفئة منازلها، مع تمكين الموزعين الألمان من بيع الفائض من الغاز بربح في جميع أنحاء أوروبا الغربية. الأمر لا يقتصر بحسب المراقبين على أن فريق بايدن فجر الأنابيب فقط، بل إنه فخور بذلك أيضا، وأن بايدن كان مستعدا للتخلص من القدرة التنافسية وفرص العمل في أوروبا خلال العقد المقبل. الآن تعد روسيا أكبر مصدر للنفط إلى الصين، وزادت صادرات النفط الروسية إلى الهند بمقدار 33 ضعفا خلال العام الماضي، وكذلك فإن المملكة العربية السعودية ضاعفت وارداتها من النفط الروسي بأكثر من الضعف. لذلك قد يجادل المرء هنا من تولى بالفعل استخدام الغاز الطبيعي وإمداداته من أجل تحقيق طموحاته السياسية والإقليمية؟ هل هي إدارة بايدن أم روسيا كما تدعي هذه الإدارة؟ واليوم من هم الذين دفعوا الثمن الباهظ وسيفعلون ذلك باستمرار من الآن فصاعدا؟ من الميادين، في مان الله.